Excuse me for not standing, but I broke my foot, so I'm hobbling around. Our speaker today is Steve Garfein. He began his career in quote unquote Howard's Hobby Shop, working on the OH-6A Scout and the AH-64 Apache helicopter and various weapons systems and programs. In 1980, he founded RPM Systems. He earned his business degrees from UCLA and that other school, USC. Steve is a Rotarian and a really nice guy and a very good friend, and I think you'll enjoy his talk. He knows everything there is to know about Howard Hughes. So here goes Steve.
So a raise of hands, just a second, let's get that out of there. A raise of hands, how many of you heard me earlier, a few months ago, about the development of the Apache helicopter? Okay, so about half. This talk today changed about 2 weeks ago. The Apache, and so there's the subject, and you really wouldn't want to fly with Howard Hughes. He was a very reckless pilot. He never got to be old because of it. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to go forward and begin with the end of this presentation. And I'm doing this because of something that happened 2 weeks ago. Max, you just heard in the LA Times, there's the layoff of about 1,000 people in LA. Okay, keep that in mind. That was this morning. So, believe it or not, the hobby shop, as I refer to it, that I worked in, was the Hughes Tool Company aircraft division, later became Hughes Helicopters. And I worked with some of the same people when they, as youths, when they worked on the flying boat. And what they learned on the flying boat in terms of weight and design really came forward in some ways directly into the Apache. And I was working in this big engineering room where we were all together working on the Apache in the old days when you had drafting boards and all of that. So this is where I was going to end, but I'm going to start here. So this man, the picture that just appeared, is Jim Crabtree. And he was the weights engineer on the flying boat. And this is the Apache in 1975. This is the ground test vehicle. And it's probably difficult to see, but I'm in this picture. I'm on third from the right in those bell-bottom trousers, which were, okay. And that's the world cage. We didn't know what was going to come apart on it. And we flew it later that year. And here is a founders reunion. My wife Cindy's in this picture. I'm in this picture. They brought us all together a few years ago down at Mesa. Now, why did I start with this particular part, the end of my presentation? Because a couple of weeks ago, this program was canceled. And as you heard, for 7 years, I was part of the Apache program. And I worked for the president of the company, and I was in all the weekly program reviews. I watched the development of it. I watched all the decisions that we made. When the Army came out with their RFP, we said, we know a much better way to do this. And they allowed us to do it. And today's Apache is because of about 6 decisions that they allowed us to make because we were going to fly off with Bell Helicopter. Now, having sat in all those program reviews, which were led by the president of the company, you're not surprised to learn that I have an opinion about this replacement for the Apache. I think it's bloody awful. I think it's just a kludge designed by a committee. And why? I'm not going to spend all the times, but one of us, they wanted to go faster. So it's got a pusher prop. It's got these, the stores are come out from the fuselage instead of being out on stub wings. The Apache, I would argue, is the ugliest aircraft flying, but it does the job. So this is more detail you need. This is from the Boeing site. This is what the latest Apache does. But what's really relevant is you look at the wing store, those round canisters at the end on the pylons, those are drones. Now, the Army has no more scout helicopters. They're just too vulnerable. So when Cindy and I were down at Mesa, we got a briefing, unclassified briefing from the chief engineer. And the way he described that is those drones will go out 60 kilometers and watch the enemy come in until, quote, they are no more. So this is the future of aviation. It's all drones today. Look at what we've learned, right? And then this is the last slide, just more details about why the Apache is good. So the Apache is going to be in the inventory at least through 2040. And it first flew in 1975. It's kind of like the B-52. They're just having trouble replacing it. All right, so now we're going to go back and get to why you wouldn't want to fly with Howard. This is the handout. And what I've done is I've grayed out the areas that I'm not going to talk about. We're going to talk about the crash of the Sikorsky in Lake Mead. Howard had Asperger's syndrome. He was on the spectrum. He had OCD. He did about 4,000. I find this number hard to believe. Touch and goes in this aircraft on Lake Mead. You know, they were building the Spruce Goose. They were building the XF-11. He wasn't in Culver City. He wasn't where he needed to be. So this is the crash. These are photos of the crash. You can see the propeller went through the fuselage when the wing collapsed. And two people died on this. One was hit with the propeller. Now, this is very interesting. It wasn't until I put together this presentation that I noticed this guy. See the red arrow there? I believe that is Howard Hughes. Okay, he was knocked unconscious. Now, Ray Kirkpatrick was a peer of mine. Ray Kirkpatrick flew a lot with Howard. He described himself as Howard's co-pilot butler, okay? And Howard would disappear for long periods of time. Nobody knew where he was. This is in the middle of the war. He's trying to build a Spruce Goose and the XF-11. He's just not there. Ray was supposed to be on that flight that crashed and killed the two individuals, but they sent him back to Culver City to get some parts. And the crash occurred because there was a very heavy toolbox that was forward in the aircraft. The weight and balance was way off. It should have been in the tail. Nobody noticed it. Howard told Ray to take out the life rafts. Ray just ignored him. Howard was pulled out unconscious out of the aircraft and put in a life raft that shouldn't have been there if Ray had listened to Howard. Ray was a good friend. Now, this is what the aircraft, that's not a model. That's the real rebuilt airplane on the runway in Culver City, grass runway, by the way. And there's the interior of it. Pretty nifty aircraft. And when you go back, you look at the interior, pretty plush. I think they rebuilt this a couple times, and as of a few years ago, this aircraft still existed in a museum. All right, now we're going to talk about showboating. And we're going to talk about the crash of the XF-11. Now, over there is a storyboard. What I'm telling you is all part of a feature film that I've been writing for many years, and it keeps changing. The feature film now has a whole new perspective. It starts when Howard dies, and his cousin, Will Lummis, and I knew Will, he was the administrator of the estate, starts finding out what happened in the company, because it's a very, very secretive company. I worked with a lot of people when Howard was alive. They never said a word about him, yet they were very close to him. Afterwards, they really opened up. And I have a lot of interviews. Now, this particular event in the feature film would be maybe a few minutes that we would allow it. But this is a full hour script about showboating, just this event. And he was showboating for Jean Peters. He never talked to her. He never met her before he showed up in Newport Beach at a party. Jimmy Cagney's brother was a producer, and Howard went down there. Jean Peters was dating Audie Murphy at the time. He talks them in, the whole party is going over to Catalina on boats. He talks Jean Peters and Audie Murphy. He didn't care about Audie Murphy, obviously. To flying on the S-43 over to Catalina, and they spend the weekend there. Nothing happens, but he invites Gene to come back to the Culver City runway and watch him fly the XF-11, right? It wasn't ready to fly. The gearbox leaked. These are counter-rotating propellers. They knew it leaked. Howard had a mishap in a high-speed taxi test the day before. And there was just so much wrong. The tech rec wasn't there. It wasn't scheduled to fly. Howard didn't, there were so many pilot errors in this. And as a result, if you saw the 2004 Aviator movie, that is a pretty accurate presentation of his crash. That was really well done. It almost killed him. Jean Peters was the only one he allowed in the hospital to see him afterwards. It's a very, very long story about his relationship with Jean. He marries her 10 years later. They get divorced, on and on and on. But that's what this particular segment turns into a movie in itself, because it is so rich. So this is the second aircraft. You can tell because it doesn't have the counter-rotating propellers. They ditched them. And here are all the things that he did wrong. And I tell us there are no old pilots, right? So he loaded it up with fuel. He put up the landing gear. He just violated everything in this first flight test. And those of you who are test pilots, this was just criminal as far as I was concerned. He didn't land when he got in trouble. He could have landed right in Culver City, but he kept trying to troubleshoot it. And what had happened is one of the engine nose gearboxes had run out of oil, and the one set of blades went flat, and it was like a barn door. And he couldn't diagnose it. He fooled with the landing gear and so on. So he didn't land when he was in trouble. didn't diagnose the malfunction. He took off knowing there was an oil leak. And he would have been okay if he had had the short duration flight. He didn't take responsibility. He sued Hamilton Standard. And he didn't even have his Hamilton Standard tech rep there because it wasn't a scheduled flight. Then Hughes posted a $5 million bond because the Air Force didn't want him to fly the second XF-11. And Howard said, well, I'm going to fly it and I'll guarantee it. And he did fly it. So these two pictures I had for quite a while, maybe 20 plus years, and I never knew on the bottom right, I never knew which of the two airplanes it was. On the top left, you can see the counter-rotating propellers, but on the right, you can't see the engines, so I didn't know which aircraft, but I figured it out when you look closely. Howard doesn't have a mustache in the first one, but he has a mustache to cover the scars that he received. So the right one, and it was ultimately, he test flew it, it was ultimately just cut up. It was just too late. You know, there's a board that I passed around here. He had nervous breakdowns in the middle of all of this, and he was just gone. This aircraft is a beautiful aircraft. This weighed as much as almost a World War II bomber, the smaller of the four engines. It's had huge engines on it. It was just too late. You know, the war was over, jets were in, but it was, and actually, I found in my office, I moved a file cabinet and I found an 8.5 by 11 book of drawings of this aircraft. It's really quite amazing. Twin turbochargers on each engine. So now we're going to talk about the Spruce Goose, and I'm going through this pretty quickly, and I can give you a lot more color about each of these. So what you see here is there are three pictures of key people. I'm in the center, and in my role in the company, I had 5 departments I was responsible for. And I was a member of this 3-person committee at the top of the company, the vice president of finance, the president of the company, and me. I was about 35 years old. And basically, we had a weapons division, we had a commercial helicopter division, and we had the military helicopter division. So I had visibility over it all. And in addition, I was independent of the Apache program. So I published a weekly report on what I thought was happening. Now, we had a 2-star, Ed Brown was our champion, and he fought like hell to keep the Apache sold. But I'll talk about him in a minute because he was instrumental. So here I am, and I left the company late 1979 to start RPM Systems. In the year 2000, I decided that, well, before that, I decided this being privy to the development of the Apache was really something very special. I was in it from the beginning. I was business manager of the weapons division. So when we did the phase 1 proposal, which was different than what the Army spec said, today the Apache has something called the chain gun. Anyone heard of the chain gun? Okay. And it's a single barrel gun. They wanted a 3-barrel 20-millimeter Gatling on it. There were a lot of decisions like that. So I was the manager of the initial weapons proposal. And why that's important is 20 years later, I found out that Jack Reel, who was Howard's best friend, was up in McMinnville reassembling the Spruce Goose in the museum up there. Now, what I'm going to tell you is true, but I have trouble saying it because it's hubris to say this, but it's true. So I call up Jack and I say, "Hey, Jack, so it's 2000. This is 20 years after I left the company. I left essentially in '80 and 2000. I call him. And I said, "Hey, Jack, you remember me?" He says, "Yeah, I remember you. You were the only guy in that company that told me the truth." And and after I left, about 6 months, they cleaned house. All the Howard Hughes executives were gone. Um, so I'll pull this all together in just a second. So this is a chart that I put together maybe 20 years ago because I was really interested in the arc of Howard's life. And these dates come directly out of the best biography that was written about Howard by Bartlett and Steele. And you can see the crash. He was in trouble before the crash. He was locking himself up for months in a screening room, and he was just pretty much a mess. And that's why you see the initial high, and then at the crash in Beverly Hills, the showboating crash, he comes back. And within less than 2 years, he's flown the second XF-11 and he's flown the Spruce Goose. And he almost died when you see all the injuries to his heart and everything in that crash in Beverly Hills. So here's the aircraft. And you can really get a scale of it if you look at the bottom photograph. Look at the people clustered around the nose. This is a huge aircraft. And so not only when I was in the company, I was budgeting $750,000 a year to keep this in an air-conditioned hangar in Long Beach. Then they move it up to McMinnville, take it apart, put it on barges, bring it on trucks. And so Jack and I developed a very, very close relationship. I collaborated with him on this book. My company was going to publish it, and it was because this is a vendetta against a man who was still alive. This is Jack's book. This is a vendetta against Bill Gay, who was head of the organization, is referred to as the Mormon Mafia or the Palace Guard. And they controlled Howard, they controlled everything. They extracted contracts from him, got him to sell companies that he should never have sold. And after 9/11, I was unable to get errors and omissions insurance. And because this is such a vendetta against Bill Gay, I had my lawyer write Jack and say, what you had before I worked with you, you can publish, but you cannot use anything that I've done, because Jack was in his late 80s and at that point, and I was a lot younger than I am today, and I said, I'm not willing to risk my estate to publish this. So I had the run of this aircraft while it was being reassembled in McMinnville. And since so many of you are pilots in aviation, look at the high wing on this, okay? Now, what happens, and people don't think about this, that whole fuselage is hanging under that wing. It's attached to that wing. And if you, and I've taken tours actually I took Rotary Club and others through the aircraft. And if you look at down in the fuselage, you'll see these uprights that attach to the wing. So one day I am on the flight deck and I'm looking back at the tail. And the tail section hasn't been put back on yet. It's, let's see. Yeah, so the tail is a separate assembly. And I look back and there's that opening way back there. And there's a walkway. I said, oh, so I walk back out there and I take a picture forward to the flight deck. Now, this is a two-story aircraft. You know, the flight deck is like a 747. It's up above. But the wing hasn't been attached. So it's open and you can see the flight deck all the way through. Later on, when the wing was put on, you would never see that view again. So I have pictures and video of this being put back together again. Now here's the one and only flight. And this is the key story. There were 29 crew members on board at this point, plus Howard, 30. The control surfaces were huge. I've got some dimensions over here. Second, and there was no way they could be operated except hydraulically. So they were hydraulically controlled surfaces. This aircraft was an amazing engineering feat. And before I go on, I'll tell you a little anecdote. Howard became very reclusive, and he was in London. Jack Reel, his best friend, who made that comment about me, because I used to brief Jack on the state of the company after Howard died. At that time, I didn't know he was Howard's best friend, but he was in charge of the aviation unit when Howard died, after Howard died. So Jack has a drawing made of this aircraft with turboprop engines on it. And Howard's in bed in the inn in the park in London and kind of comatose. And Howard says to Jack, has anyone seen these drawings? And Jack says, no. And Howard says, destroy them. This is my legacy. And, you know, having been involved with the aircraft when I was inside the company, and afterwards, it's only years later, I realized what a magnificent achievement it was. And Howard saw that as his legacy. And I've really come full circle to appreciate what he really achieved. Now, how many of you have ever been in the Spruce Goose? Wow, that's about a third. That's fantastic. How long? 5 minutes? Okay, 15 or so. Okay, good. So here's the real story about this flight. In the 2004 movie, in the co-pilot seat was this fictitious character called, he was a meteorologist. Well, that's not who was in the co-pilot seat. It was the chief hydraulics engineer, Dave Grant. And let's see what the next is. Okay, well, this is Jim Crabtree again. He was my counterpart when we bid on the Apache the first time. He was the business manager of the helicopter division. I was the business manager of the weapons division. And what's interesting about this is a drawing book. I've got it over here, the original. And it had printed estimated weights. You know, those of you who worked on aircraft know that you do weight estimates. And one of the things that Elon Musk does that we did is when you're designing, design it so it'll break. Does that make sense? Anyone know what I mean by that? If you design it so it won't fail, you'll never get the weight out. You design it so you find the weak spots and then add the weight in. And that is one of the reasons that we just wiped out Bell Helicopter in the Apache competition. We had a vertical rate of climb that was twice what Bell had for a number of reasons. So Jim Crabtree, he's part of the legacy. A small group was still there. Now, this is Jack Reel on the left, and that's him and me. I'm filming him. I've got hours and hours of interview with him about, he was Howard's best friend, tried to save him from the Palace Guard. It's a very, very long story. And we got to know Jack very, very well. Now, before I finish the story about what happened on that flight, let me just give you some ideas. This is it when it was assembled in McMinnville. This is about 20 years ago or more. And this is Don Smith, the flight engineer. And Dave Grant was in the co-pilot seat. So when it lifted off the water, there was a lot of noise. There were 30 people on board. Don's the flight engineer, and he heard Dave Grant yell something at Howard, but he couldn't hear it over the engine noise. And they got it back down on the water, got it to the dock. Howard left the aircraft. Don said to Dave, "What did you yell at Howard?" He said, "I yelled, put the power back on." Well, the 8 engines, 2 of them had hydraulic pumps that fed the flight controls. When it lifted off, people say Howard intended to fly it at that time. I don't know that he did. I think that he was very surprised that it lifted off, is my theory. But what happened is he panicked and he chopped all the throttles back to idle. And therefore, he had no flight controls for a few seconds. And if Dave Grant had not been in that seat and yelled at him to put the power back on, let your imagination go wild. I mean, just one of the floats digging in and cartwheeling with 30 people on board, no life vests. Okay. There was a person behind every engine, 8 engines. The wing route is 11 feet. So in other words, when you're on the flight deck, you can walk out into the wing. How many of you have that? Right. You can actually walk out in the wing. There's a mechanic, and I've interviewed 2 of them. So this gives you an idea of the size. This again is a very old photograph when I was just in the museum. Now, this is from the pilot's seat. So this is what Howard saw when he looked to the left. Kind of gives you an idea of the scale of the other aircraft below. This is me. Bottom left is when it's being put back together again, and this is a later date when it was unveiled. All right, now I think we're into the epilogue, and I believe this is where I started. I started with the epilogue because the Apache lives. And here's Jack Reel, and that's Will Lummis. Will Lummis is Howard's cousin. Lummis hadn't seen him since Lummis was maybe 10 years old. Very secretive organization. Lummis is a very, very successful Houston lawyer. And once a month, both of them would come down to a small conference room and with a few of the helicopter executives, and I would brief them on the state of the company. In about 1999, I realized that Howard Hughes fit the diagnosis of Asperger's syndrome. And I talked to Will Lummis about it. I wrote a paper about it. I talked to the leading expert on that in Australia, Dr. Tony Atwood, and explained a lot of the behaviors that I observed because I was quite unhappy with Howard Hughes when I left the company. And today I have a lot of empathy for him and for his genius. So I developed a very good relationship with both of these gentlemen because of my briefings. And that's where I started. So that's it. There's so much more to this story. Stay tuned for the film. So let me take questions and okay, why don't you come over here and we'll start here.
Didn't he own TWA for a while? You didn't mention anybody about his TWA ownership and how he carried out that campaign.
Oh, it was an absolute disaster. He micromanaged it. He could not. He couldn't keep executives. He lost control of the company because the bank said, if you lose one more executive after we've loaned you this money, then he ran RKO into the ground, you know.
Brought in a constellation.
He was influential with Kelly Johnson in the Constellation. But it's interesting because I'm pretty much an expert on Elon Musk and his rocket ventures. Musk has Asperger's syndrome, but it's a completely different story in terms of success.
Not even about Howard Hughes, just a silly technical question. You started off with the Apache,
Yeah,
had a drone on the wing. I
yeah,
assume it detached and then flew away.
yeah, that's just the container, yes.
Did it come back or did they just?
No, it's disposable. It's disposable, you know? And this is such a good decision. When they started that replacement for the Apache, how many years ago? Where was drone warfare then? You know?
I'll talk about.
No, 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 no. See, I'm hard of hearing.
What?
I'm hard of hearing. So use the microphone, hold it close.
All right. My question is, after the flight test with Howard Hughes, were there taxi tests done in the water with that aircraft?
On the Spruce Goose?
Yeah.
Were there other tests?
Yes.
Absolutely not.
Okay.
It went back in the barn. Don Smith, who I talked about, they wanted to fly it. And Howard would not let anyone fly it. I didn't think it was safe to fly because when it lifted off the water, there were a lot of gussets popped and so on. But here's a very interesting thing. There's a book about Howard Hughes and his flying boat done by a Navy captain who flew flying boats in World War II. And I had dinner with him in Washington, D.C. about 25 years ago. And he was sent out to Culver City Because at the time, the Russians had these big aircraft that were bigger than the Spruce Goose, but they flew in ground effect. And they had intercontinental missiles on them. So these existed. There are pictures of these. And our community wanted to take the Spruce Goose out and learn about flying in ground effect. And they absolutely wouldn't allow it. Hughes wouldn't allow it. So more questions? Oh. Get you next.
Story one time about the fact that Robert Hughes would not get paid by the government who commissioned the plane unless they could get it off the water. And they sabotaged it, so the ailerons were not attached. So we put a person on each one pulled up that aileron to get it to go up in the air to get it off the water. And that's the way he got the government to pay for it. I don't know the truth of that or not.
No, I don't think it's true. First of all, those control surfaces were 70 feet long. They were huge. They were wings in themselves. I mean, many of you have flown small aircraft with smaller wings than those flaps. So no, that was, but I hadn't heard it before. And I think he put about $6 million of his own money in the aircraft.
I'm just curious, what was the driving force in Howard Hughes' life? Was he an adventurer, a lust guy, a business guy? What drove Howard Hughes?
You know, it turns out Elon Musk and Howard Hughes had very, very different fathers. And I think that's part of it. Elon Musk's father was just terrible in every way. Howard's father was just fantastic entrepreneur. Everybody loved him. He was very, very outgoing. His mother was paranoid over disease. She controlled Howard tremendously. Howard had a complete disregard for people, and more severe than you would think. During the Spruce Goose design and the XF-11 design, he'd have people come up to his home in Bel Air, beginning meetings at 2 o'clock in the morning. After they'd worked a whole day, he wouldn't even offer his engineers a glass of water. So he was pretty much a mess and very, very selfish. Didn't trust, couldn't retain good executives. No, you're not gonna be any different. You've got a great voice, but here, pass this over.
The long table. Yeah, I was just been reading Bob Hoover's book, and he talked about him and a friend wanted to go and see the Spruce Goose. I presume this was in maybe the 50s.
Yeah.
Or something like that. And he called, Bob called the president at the time of the company, and he says, "Hey, even I haven't gotten to see this airplane, because it was under such wraps at the time." And then through some clandestine process, they were able to see the airplane, and they were put into like Tyvek hazmat suits to crawl on board and see the flight deck and everything like that. So it was some like extremely high intensity secretive thing at the time. Why was that the case post-war, and I presume during when Howard was still alive and kind of pedantic?
Well, first of all, I never saw the Spruce Goose when I worked in the company. Secondly, Howard was absolutely paranoid about germs. If you know anything about him, he wrote long procedures about how many pieces of Kleenex to take when you're going to hand him a water bottle. So the guy was pretty much a mess. And I'm sure there are a lot of different reasons. But once Howard died, Will Lummis took over. There were a lot of meetings down at the hangar, photographs, people could go in the aircraft, but I'd left the company by that time. Yes, I think we're getting close. This is the last one? Okay, one more.
Just one more comparison to Elon Musk. Reading Elon Musk's biography, it sounds like he pulled a lot of all-nighters with other engineers sorting out really sticky engineering problems. Was Howard Hughes a talented engineer? Was he involved in the product design process himself?
That's a good question. I've never been asked that before. He was self-taught. Really had very little formal education, whereas Elon Musk is a physicist, and was there in the trenches, working all night, sleeping on the floor, you know, which Howard just removed himself. Well, I thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Price?
Wait.